Welcome everyone to STATSports series session number 8, but the first one for monitoring on the gridiron American football, a roundtable discussion. So glad you guys can make it. I'm excited. We've got a great group of guests for you. Let me first just talk a little bit about STATSports and what STATSports is all about. STATSports is the most powerful performance analysis GPS device ever developed, everyone. We're privileged to partner and work with professional and collegiate teams, leagues, and governing bodies around the world, including the NCAA and the NFL. And STATSports technology has been designed with input from leading practitioners in the field of sports science and strength and conditioning. The flexibility of the STATSports system has allowed it to be used across multiple sports like soccer, rugby, and obviously American football. The last thing I'll say, everyone, and then I'm gonna keep it moving, is that STATSports recently became the only wearable sports technology GPS device out of 30 that was approved by FIFA for data accuracy, data reliability, and data consistency. This was a 4-year study, everyone. And so just wanted you to know a little bit about STATSports, and we will continue to move on. My name is Cecil Martin. And for those of you that don't know me, I played my college ball at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, those Badgers in the Big Ten. Played in the NFL for the Philadelphia Eagles, was a 4-year starter there. I played with the Oakland Raiders and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Spent 12 years broadcasting NFL games on TV in London, England on Sky Sports. And I've done football camps all over America, all over Canada, all over the United Kingdom, and Europe. So those of you that are on here that don't know, American football is huge all over the world. So with that being said, let's get into the guests that are here. The guys that are going to be talking about wearable monitoring, workload, practical applications for working in elite football, and basically, strength and conditioning and sports science. We got Marc Lewis, Virginia Tech football director of sports science. We got Adam Lachance from the Miami Dolphins, sports science coordinator, strength and conditioning assistant. We got Chris Laskowski, Charlotte 49ers Director of Football Performance, and Grant Geib, Western Michigan University Broncos Football Director of Strength and Conditioning. I'd like to take a moment and just talk about each one of these gentlemen real quick, just so you have a feel for the type of talent and the type of professional that is here. Let's start with my man, Marc Lewis. Marc Lewis, as I've said, is Director of Sports Science for the Virginia Tech Hokies. He runs the athlete monitoring program for the football team. Marc holds a Master's of Science from Virginia Tech and spent this past year as an Applied Sports Science Fellow with Ben Hilgard. Marc is also pursuing his PhD in exercise physiology. And if that wasn't enough, Marc also served our country honorably and courageously as an airborne infantryman. So glad you're here, Marc. Looking forward to getting your insight. Next, we have Adam Lachance, Miami Dolphins sports science coordinator, strength and conditioning assistant. Adam Lachance earned his Bachelor of Science for exercise physiology with a minor in sports medicine. Adam would go on to get his Master's of Science in exercise physiology, strength and conditioning, and entrepreneurship. And Adam is also a person who served our country in the Army as an airborne infantry. Both of you gentlemen, thank you so much for your service. Next, we've got my man, Grant Geib, the Western Michigan University Broncos Director of Strength and Conditioning. Grant Geib enters his 4th season as the Western Michigan University Director of Strength and Conditioning football. Previous to that, to getting to Western Michigan, he spent 5 years in the Big Ten with the Purdue Boilermakers. At Purdue, he was sports science coordinator in charge of management of data and performance technology and analytics. If that wasn't enough, He worked with all aspects of football, all aspects of the football program at Purdue, which included conditioning, nutrition, and serving as assistant strength and conditioning for the D-backs and the wide receivers. That is our panel. And let me just ask that the boys come on and show your face, turn your mics on, and let's have a little bit of fun. Gentlemen. Gentlemen, did I do your bios justice?
Good to go. Appreciate the introduction.
Good, good. Just a little housekeeping real quick, everyone. If you're on here, you'll see down at the bottom, there's a question and answer section. At the end of this, we'll be taking questions and answers. So you're more than welcome to take notes, put your questions in there, and we'll get to them, at the end, okay? We got my good friend, Nick Dykes, who's our sports scientist in the background there, monitoring it all. So any questions that you guys might have, just throw it in there and we'll make sure that we get to them by the end. All right, so let's get this party started. So we're talking about athlete monitoring. We're talking about GPS. We're talking about sports science and strength and conditioning. You know, when I think about that, there's three main things, right? You're talking about developing performance development on the field. We're talking about minimizing injury, and we're also talking about return to play. Once there is an injury, getting a guy back. All right. I want to just start this conversation off, and I'll start with you. Chris. Talk about the relationship between what you do in the weight room and what you do and what you monitor on the field for your players.
Yeah. So I guess from the relationship standpoint, we like to say, and we like to aim for, is, especially as we're getting closer to a football season, that our exercise program, right? Our program design has a dynamic correspondence that's really close to a one-to-one standpoint between what we do in a weight room or on the football field and what we do as we practice the game or play the game. So and I've felt this for a long time intuitively, and it's been confirmed and tweaked over the years. But the idea that a sprint, that running is 100%, right, one-to-one ratio dynamically corresponded to the game that we play. Now, an offensive lineman and a defensive back, obviously they play different games essentially, right? We're all playing football, but that their movement strategies throughout that football game could not be more different. But they all run and they all will run. And I do believe that a sprint, a top end sprint, for example, a max velocity sprint, is one of the purest forms of a plyometric exercise that we can develop and train, right? That's in our disposal, right? Or in our wheelhouse of exercise selection. So for us, if we can track, velocity measures in the weight room and track a bar speed of a certain movement, a squat, a clean, a press. If now we can also track max speed or top end speed or a top miles per hour for our football team. To me, that's helped me kind of train and periodize our max velocity sprinting mechanics and program design throughout an off season. So it's created a tremendous amount of buy-in for our guys. Even in year one, we've had STATSports technology at our disposal now for a year, and it's helped us, create even more of that buy-in for that speed training aspect, which has been one of my favorite elements of this technology from a performance side, right? Aside from injury prevention and tracking, loads and stress of our athletes. But from a performance side, I was excited about this, and the kids have really bought into this idea that, on a max velocity sprint day, which has been our Thursdays in our summer training program, they can't wait to hear the iPad, pop off at after they get done with their flying 10 or their weave sprint and see what they hit. And then at the end of the day, if we have multiple sessions, we're sending out a graphic on social media and letting our guys know who are the top speed guys of the day. So that's been a fun element of tracking and training, right, our guys.
Chris, I appreciate that, big guy. And I have to profusely apologize that I did not do your bio. So you just leave that pretty face up there so I can let everyone know exactly who Chris Laskowski is. He's the director of football performance at Charlotte 49ers. You know, one big thing about Chris, and I love this, is that he played football at Florida Atlantic, walked on, but 2 years later would become an MVP, and the next year a co-MVP. Started his coaching career in high school, and has had an unbelievable career. You know, Chris has been a sports performance coach at Old Dominion, working with football and men's soccer, football performance coach at University of Virginia, director of sports performance at Austin Peay State University, before latching on with the Charlotte 49ers. I'm so glad you're here, man, and I appreciate it. So sorry I forgot to introduce you earlier on. But let me move this over to Grant. Grant over there at Western Michigan. You know, talk about that relationship between what you do with your guys in the weight room and what you do with your guys on the field, and how monitoring plays a part in how you analyze you know, their loads as well as their development.
Absolutely. So I think, you know, Chris really served it up in terms of talking about, all right, the goal and the objective of any training program is that it translates to the football field, right? Anytime that we're spending in the weight room and the speed training, flexibility, mobility, it's all about developing a comprehensive skill set that's going to transfer over to the game of football. So whether that's us monitoring things in the weight room, and I know, Coach, you just alluded to some velocity-based training. We spend a lot of time on that as well. We're now, okay, we're looking at explosiveness and the way, okay, let's measure bar speed. So not just how strong is a guy, but how explosive and powerful, how fast can they move the bar, because it translates to the game of football. It's become a huge element in the weight room. And I think the GPS is a similar thing where now we're talking about, you know, the speed training aspect. How do we translates over to the game? And it's huge to be able to measure it, because if we know this is how far we need to run in the game, and this is how fast we need to run in the game, and how much time we're going to spend sprinting, how much time we're going to spend jogging, well, now it gives us a very clear picture in terms of programming and development in the whole preparation process. And one of the things that I like about it, and it's the hot button, is the miles per hour, right? That's what everybody wants to see. So everybody wants to know how fast can the guys run. And I think it's huge to be able to measure that in training and then see what it looks like on the football field, because that's a direct carryover, right? If we're out there, you know, running 40s and we're doing all the speed training and top end and acceleration, well, we want to know that it's going to show up on the football field. And because we can measure it and then go ahead and once practice starts, we can start to see that transfer of training effect. And I think that's, for me, that's a huge part of it, because trying to hit that bullseye from preparation to the actual applied, what we see out there in practice, and more importantly in the game, being able to have that information really sets us up on a path to be able to do so.
Man, that's great, Grant. You know, and I want to move over to the NFL side, you know, with Adam. Adam, you get less time with the players than the college coaches on here do. Is there a little bit of a different way you approach the relationship between what you're doing with your guys in the weight room with the limited time you have with them, to how you analyze and monitor the data when they get on the football field? Adam, you there?
Yep. So for us, it's kind of like, since you do have limited time, you kind of have to decide which is the lowest hanging fruit. You know, what's going to be the most bang for your buck? What's going to be the most important for coach? What does he want to see when it's time for them to actually start practicing? You know, and for us, sometimes during like early on, we're doing movement preps, and maybe it doesn't really represent or look like or feel like where it relays or translates to the field, to the athlete themselves. So, you know, sometimes we'll often say is like, okay, this might not be a movement that you are familiar with. And you might sit here and say, this doesn't make me a better football player, but all in turn, it makes you a better mover, it makes you a better athlete. And that's kind of what we're trying to do during those phases. And then having that translate to the field in a way where when we start getting into the lifts and stuff like that in the weight room, where you can probably pause a guy and maybe he's doing a lateral squat, or he's doing a single leg slide board hamstring curl, right? So, and then you could take a picture of him basically and turn it upside down and say, this is what it looks like when you're running, almost look he's in perfect running position or something like that. So you can translate things to the player that way, and that way you can get a little bit more buy-in out of them. But as far as like a load management system, we'll definitely use the player load that we get from the field. We also take the player load that we get from the weight room. We kind of combine it into one, and then we can kind of help maybe control what we can control at some point. If we need to monitor a guy, I always kind of like the soup analogy there, where if the if it's boiling, you got to turn it down a little bit. Sometimes you can't control all of it, so you just kind of pick and choose what you can, and that way you can kind of fine tune on that.
Oh, definitely. Just so you guys know, Marc Lewis, our resident PhD guy, Director of Sports Science at Virginia Tech, he's having some technical difficulties, but we're gonna continue talking about this. Again, one of the things that I talked about, performance development. Grant, why don't you go into how do you approach how you look at data, how you monitor that data, how you use GPS in the off season, typically when there's no COVID-19 situation, pandemic that's getting in the way. How do you typically use GPS monitoring for development of performance?
Definitely. So I think, the first and most important thing is working backwards from what the end goal is. If we know that this is the goal, this is the loads that we see when we get to camp, and then more importantly, when we get down the line to the football game, that's our end game. That's what we have to prepare the athletes for. So everything from an off-season standpoint is really working backwards from that. And then it's a steady progress of, okay, how do we build them up, whether it's top speed to be able to go out and compete and pull away from guys on the field, right? Everybody wants the dynamic playmakers. How do we make sure we get them to where they were the year before and then better and find a way to surpass it in our speed program? Then also in terms of volume and conditioning, when we're in the wintertime, we don't need to spend a whole lot of time running 7,000 yards in a day, right? They don't need to be able to do that until August. But when we get to July, well, now that becomes pretty important that we're preparing them for that workload and being able to, compete at that level. And then same thing with everything in between. We're looking at total yards, and then we like to look at a metric called active yards. So it's how much time the guys spend over 4 miles per hour. That's a really big metric for us because we might look at a practice and the guy's at 7,000 yards in the practice, but maybe 50% or less of those were spent at 4 miles per hour or faster. So now that gives us a little bit better of idea. Okay, 3,500, that's much more manageable for us to think about how we're going to attack and work up to in a conditioning session, right? Because we're never going to run 7,000 yards in a session, and we don't need to, because we found through the GPS, we have the data to know we're not going to practice slow jogging, walking. The guys can do that all day long. That's not an important part of the puzzle. So I think that's really where it comes from, is looking at that end game. And then from a volume and intensity standpoint, how do we work our way up to that from total speed, from sprinting, and then yardage overall in terms of preparation. And then in the sport of football, most of us all have spring practice thrown in there in the middle somewhere as well. And so then it becomes important for us, all right, for the wintertime, we're preparing them for spring. We get a snapshot of where they're at and kind of an automatic, practice test for us. That's the pre-test. Let's see where they're at in the spring. And that gives us a really good idea at where we got to do more work for the summer to get these guys ready to go for the season.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I was just getting ready to ask Chris to comment on just, where are you trying to get the guys up to into spring ball? Are you expecting them to be at, kind of that 100%? Or are you expecting them to not be at that height? And Chris, I guess I'll ask you, you almost have two parts of the offseason. You got what happens leading into spring ball, and then what happens leading into camp. Is there a difference between how you use data analytics, how you use monitoring, how you use GPS from both of those milestones?
Yeah, there is. And Coach Healy and myself have now been, teammates in this thing. Going into 5 off seasons now. This is our 5th off season, obviously a unique one. But when we've done it the best in our estimation, and we were able to inspire to go spring ball as early as we can. So we had about a 4 or 5 week winter at Austin Peay in 2016, and then this past year we had 2 years ago, when we started the first off season here, we had an early winter as well. The idea with that is to have almost 2 summer blocks, right? If you have, if you have at least 5 to maybe 7 weeks of training post spring break for us, when the weather's warmer, and I've never had an indoor facility that I've been able to utilize in my college career as a coach. So as the weather gets better, we transition a lot more to outside, and the rain's not a factor, the cold's not a factor, and we can train higher octane speeds, when that weather's not a factor. So if we can get spring ball done early, have kind of like 2 summer blocks, almost have like a late spring, which is a phase 1, and then we get to let those guys really kick them out in the month of May. Give them at least 2 weeks where they're away from the facility has been my goal. So they come back refreshed, come back hungry. I got that from Frank Wintrick at Virginia. I thought it was a pretty sound idea. And it's different for each team. Every team's different. Every culture is different. Some teams you have to kick out. Some teams you don't have to kick out. You got to, inspire to get back in. But if we can get like a late summer, 5 weeks is pretty good. The 2016 year at Austin Peay, we had 7 weeks of late spring where that was, we got a lot accomplished. And then we let him go for a little while, brought him back for another 8 to 10 week summer. You have a couple weeks of discretionary period in there. Now, during that summer period, if that's the case, we're going to peak our top speed probably before July 4th, because I've never been the one to be confident testing these guys in July. Now we'll do top end work, but it's 90-95%. We don't, we try to help these guys understand their bodies tactfully, or tactically, excuse me. And so they understand that, okay, this is a day that I feel good and I can maybe open this thing up, or maybe this is a day that I don't feel as good, but I'll still work mechanics and I'm still in that 90% range, but not open that thing up because you're too close to a training camp where we need you 100%. So if that answers your question, if you have a later spring, if I have 7 weeks before spring ball in the wintertime and I have an indoor, really there's no restrictions. But if there's no indoor, I think you really have to be smart with what you're doing outside, in terms of high speed, high octane type sprint work. So what is that? That prevents a challenge if you're going to spring ball, because the coaches are going to have, day 1, day 2 without pads. And, as much as we educate our, each other, and it's a give and take relationship, but you know how it is. Day one of football, whenever you got the helmets on, it's exciting, and stress levels are high, and we need to prepare these guys for that sort of stress at some level. Now, that being said, another little quick tangent. Grant and I, and I've all 3 of these gentlemen, we've had a chance to connect over the course of the past month, and it's been a topic of discussion on, do you use a top speed metric without pads in a summer training environment, and let that be your top mile per hour as a reference point throughout the season, or do you use probably a lower practice max and game max, fully padded with pads and helmets on? And what we found in our last year of data is there was about 10 guys on our football team that got into an open competition type 40, 50, 60 yard top end sprint in a game that reached really close, like 98% of a top speed they hit running a 40 in April of last year, or in June and July doing some top end work. But that ain't many. So, and it probably was more like 5 or 6. So most of the guys' top speed without pads on is like 1.5 miles or even 2 miles an hour faster than what they would hit in pads. So we've had a good discussion, I think, and I've kind of changed my mind moving into this next off season in terms of having a train max and having a padded max, and using, okay, what do we want these guys to be able to hit first day of spring ball? Well, it's probably going to be closer to that padded max. And then when we get the pads on, almost like you're definitely going to expect the speeds a little bit lower. So it's kind of a roundabout answer, but I want to get these guys running as fast as possible in the month of June is really how I've looked at this in the past few years. Yeah.
No, and I'm glad you asked that. And I want to pose this to everyone. I mean, what you're talking about is establishing those thresholds, and how do you establish those thresholds, and when's the right time to establish those thresholds? And, I throw it, back to you, Adam, with the NFL guys, at what point during that off season are you establishing those thresholds, and are you establishing them with pads on or without pads on? And I'll say that with this, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, Chris, and that's why I mentioned, the accuracy, reliability, and consistency, because I know all of you guys are confident in whatever method you use, it's going to be consistent and reliable, right? And that allows your data and your decision-making to be that much better. But Adam, go ahead and touch on that, establishing those thresholds, and when do you really push your guys, and what do you use, on pads or off pads?
Yeah, so for us, I mean, when you're talking about pads and no pads, I mean, you start getting into some of the CBA rules that exist of when we're actually able to get the guys in pads. And by that point, they're already practicing, So for us, it'd be, we only really have a few weeks with them before they start integrating the coaching period. And then, they start doing some practices, and then another week or so before they start lining up on each other. And then another week before they start doing group practices or whatever it is. So really for the off season, like for the most part, we're really just trying to get these guys robust enough. Maybe get close to some of those top speeds. And our focus really isn't trying to get them hitting top speeds. It's more just making sure their movement quality is appropriate. They're efficient, their economy, they're robust enough to actually handle those loads right when practice starts to come, because we want to make sure those guys are healthy enough and able to withstand those loads that are going to start showing up when coach comes in and starts kind of testing them a little bit, see where they're at. And like when it comes down to it, when they start practicing, especially the first couple of times they get out there, it's, everybody's excited, everyone's going. So the intensity is going to be high. So you kind of anticipate them, they're going to start moving pretty quickly. So once they start practicing, that's when we kind of start monitoring them and see where they're at, maybe compare it to historical data and see, maybe is the guy heavier? Did the coach want him heavier because he put him in a different position or whatever it is? And that could change things. So there's a lot of contextual factors there too that you gotta kind of have to put into play as well. As far as that, yeah, top speed isn't really something I should say, look at so much from a off-season standpoint and seeing where they're at. I mean, it's always good. Eventually you'll see that. And it's more just kind of calling the guy out a little bit. It's like, okay, could you have gone harder on that play? I was working. It was okay. Well, last year in the game, you hit 22 miles an hour. You only hit 15 right there. So I'm calling you out a little bit, and I want to see more out of you, whatever it is. So we still use it in certain ways. It's just maybe not in the same way some college settings or they're able to use it more so because sometimes are a little bit more limited on what we can do during that time. If that makes sense.
Yeah. And just for those who are listening, when he mentioned CBA, he meant the collective bargaining agreement. That's the NFL and the NFL, Players Association, just so people know. And Grant, you mentioned something before. You mentioned some of the metrics that you use, and you guys were able to come up with a certain type of metrics. I know that one of the things that we pride ourselves on at STATSports is giving you that ability to create the metrics that you feel like are most important. Talk a little bit about the metric that you use, that you talked about in relation to the dynamic stress load metric. And I know that when we had talked before, you had said you'd take a look at the fatigue index as well. Now, for those who are listening, these are different metrics that you have access to, but you also have the ability to begin to be more innovative like Grant has. Can you talk a little bit about those relationships, Grant?
Absolutely. So I think one of the first things that it comes back to is, again, a huge benefit of the system and being able to monitor the athletes is let us be proactive in the recovery process, right? And proactive in the injury prevention process. And by having information to do so, it makes it more powerful for us to do our job and first and foremost, protect the athletes. And so one of the things that we look at and we put a lot of stock into doing that is really an overall loading number. And so for the load number that we use to quantify the intensity of practice, we look at the speed intensity, which is a STATSport metric, and it's a weighted metric. So the harder and longer the guys run, the more points, for lack of a better word, they score in that speed intensity. And then also we look at high metabolic load distance, which factors in the guy's body weight and then factors in kind of acceleration and deceleration. So that one's a good one for us, where it's not just overall speed yardage, but now we're working at some short space quickness, and it's relative to the size of the athlete as well, which in the game of football is huge when you got guys ranging from 180 pounds to 320, sometimes more than that. And so those are the two metrics that we look at to calculate load. So high metabolic load distance and then speed intensity. We reference both of those off of the individual's average. And so by looking at the individual's average, now we look at, okay, for this guy's average over 3 weeks, this is what their load is for speed intensity. And then we look at that as a percentage scale up to 100%. We do the same thing with high metabolic load distance, and we factor those together to get a total score. So then when we're putting on a report and coach looking at, all right, he's at 90% or 80%, depending on how those factors in based off the individual. Now, one thing that we've done that's been really awesome for us in the past few years, and I got to give the credit to Emmett, our guy at STATSports, because he's the one who put this idea in my head, but we reference that against dynamic stress load. So where speed intensity is the weighted, right, we're looking at, all right, how fast and how far these guys are running. Now we're looking at dynamic stress load, which is based on impacts, and same thing, it's loaded. So the higher the impacts, the more that it's weighing in on the athlete. Well, we look at that as a measure of stress on the athlete's system. And we will look at that compared to the individual percentage. So now I can look at, all right, my load percentage was 80% and my stress percentage was 80%. So it's 1-to-1. And that's most of the time about what it should be. But when that ratio starts to flip a little bit, when it gets to about 1.1, all right, now we start to look at it a little bit more. And then when it gets to 1.2, we are very heavily involved in the recovery process in terms of what the guy's load is going to be the next day at practice so that we can be proactive in approach to protect these guys as we're going through the week. You know, Coach Laskowski, I talked the other day when we were getting ready for this thing, he was talking about the demands of not just one day, but stacking days back to back to back. And I think that's where this stuff becomes even more powerful, where it's awesome that we can quantify today was a really hard day. But more important than that, we need to know, okay, if today was really hard, then it has to factor into our decision-making the next day. Because we know from the research that if you start stacking on these high-load days, it can really be a factor. So, again, that ratio for us has been huge and something we use a lot and put a lot of stock in, that load-to-stress ratio on our guys.
We got our resident PhD back. Mark, you there? Can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm here. I appreciate you guys hanging with me with some connectivity issues there.
No, that's okay. That's okay. As long as you can hear us, because I want to throw something out at you because, Grant just mentioned something and it goes to periodization, right? How do you look at data from a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, even quarter-to-quarter, right? Off season versus during season. What are those important metrics that you're looking at from a periodization standpoint?
Yeah, so Grant brought up a lot of great points there. When I wanted to put something out there that would be easily communicated to coaches and something that we could look at in terms that everyone understands. So I cluster the metrics based on volume, intensity, density, and collision load. And in a daily coaches report, we put those metrics and classify them under those different constructs, under those 4 constructs. And so when we're monitoring, we compare all individuals to themselves. And so when we're monitoring, we establish individual norms and what 1 and 2 standard deviations from that norm look like. And we've got enough data now that we're able to do that. So we use a standard traffic light system to be able to understand when guys are, a standard deviation above or below their norms. Because again, like you're wanting to monitor fatigue and readiness in your guys, but you're also wanting to make sure guys that aren't getting as much work as they need are able to step in, and you can adjust practice to make sure they get the work they need to stay ready. And so really, Grant hit on the high metabolic load distance. When I did some original analyses, high metabolic load distance for our skills and big skills explained most of the variance in our observations within that population. So we use high metabolic load distance as our intensity measure, the high metabolic load distance per minute as our density. Our volume is total distance, and then collision load for our collision contact metric. And we use high metabolic load distance as well. Like, for example, right now we're putting in our summer conditioning program based on the ever-changing days and weeks we're going to be able to work with here. And we use that because, as Grant also mentioned, that encompasses high-speed running volume. So you're always going to cover that, but it also accounts for accelerations and decelerations above a certain threshold that you can set. And we use that to prescribe kind of the plan's progression in intensive yardage prescribed over the course of the conditioning program. So for example, if we're working with 6 weeks this summer, which we might, we'll start at maybe, let's say 40% based on what they do the first couple of weeks. We have them back in like a phase 0. And so we'll start at 40% and then progress like 40, 50, 60, 70%, and accordingly, using that high metabolic load distance as our metric there. I think Grant also brought up another great point. It's about trimming down some of these metrics so that you can figure out what works for you, and what you can best utilize, because you can drown in all these metrics that are out there. And so I think being able to collect enough data to where you have enough data points to really look at and analyze and see some patterns and do some things, and then figuring out, okay, out of all of this, what explains most of that variance? What am I able to look at that really, I'm able to manipulate or track that tells me the most I can, and trimming that down. Because, really, you got to remember too, like looking at this, you have to communicate this to give them something, and because they're the decision makers, whether it's the football coach, depending who you're working with and what your role is, you have to be able to communicate and actionable. And so, that's a little bit about what we track and how we might use that.
That's great. I mean, and it's interesting that Grant and I had a conversation yesterday, and we were talking about all the different metrics and all the different ways that different practitioners like you guys use them. And I made an analogy that, it's almost like being an artist. You got the brush, you got the paint, you have all these different tools, and it's up to you to figure out, what gives you the information that helps the player and the team get to where they want to get to. And I guess off of that, I want to talk a little bit about communication to the coaches. All of you are pure sports scientists, but also pure strength and conditioning coaches. And, today those gel together more than they ever have before. I'll start with you, Chris. The communication with your coaches, how important is that? And what types of metrics do you generally give them? And then what general metrics do you look at that they don't look at? That's important to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that, to back up a little bit, my number one priority in seeking out a GPS tracking and accelerometer tracking system a year ago was that I had not had experience in it as a practitioner, working in the high school ranks for 6 years and then getting into a smaller, lower budget collegiate environment. And so, selfishly, I didn't want to get passed up. There was a lot of trends that were going on that I was not aware of and didn't know how to utilize. And so, and also, we have young, hungry professionals that come through our ranks, and I wanted to make sure these young professionals had access to these technologies, because it's extremely relevant. It's not going away, and we're going to continue to implement these strategies better and better as years go on. I've learned so much from Grant, Marc, and Adam, specifically. Grant's utilized the system now for 3 years, and they have streamlined the communication process for them and for their culture and their staff to performance interaction. Everybody's different, and I think it's such a beautiful organic process that takes work and takes positivity, right? And takes a willingness on both parties to engage with one another. Our head coach does a great job on stimulating that, interaction. But, if I, and it happened early on as I was learning this system, the coaches wanted to know, hey, when should I pull back, right? Or when should I turn up? And I'm going, I didn't have direct answers yet, because I'm, as I kept hearing from other people, you're going to need to get the system for a year, 2 years, really, to get a compilation of data where you can use some of these high metabolic distance measures, for example, and what Grant's doing right now with his dynamic stress load and speed intensity, using 3 week averages and a running average to set thresholds, I think is brilliant. And we're going to implement that in our own way starting this year. So to answer your question, in communication standpoint, I've tried different strategies. Our coaching staff is kind of a young, right, hip kind of generation, coaching staff. And if it's not on their phone, it's going to be hard for them. They're not a real big pull it up in our email, and if you give them a piece of paper, it might get lost or left in a team room, right? So it's like, can I give them something that they can look on their phone and just quick, refresh and see? A couple of coaches understood this technology because they're young and they actually played in the NFL and played in college and actually coached in college at some places that had this technology. And so, our receivers coach, for example, Montero Hardesty, it was easy to connect with. He's like, midway through practice, hey, where's Tuck? Where's Dollar? How much high-speed run do they have? Where are they at? And if I talked to before about pulling back, we were on kind of a one-to-one communication, ratio. We were there ready to pull back if needed. But, some of the other coaches, it just took a little longer for them to kind of buy in. So to me, it's something that, in my estimation, that needs to be continually worked on and addressed so that, it's efficient, right? We don't want to bring, and Grant did a great job explaining to us, we don't want to bring a 3 to 4 page analysis for our football coaching staff. We want to give them the nuts and bolts and what they need to know. And if we can do it digitally and use technology, it's even more efficient. And so
no, that's great.
I hope that makes some sense. And I did want to buzz real quick in reference to Adam's point about, the CBA agreement and training NFL guys. When I said I want to hit top speed in June, that's certainly dependent upon like the college environment and the opportunity to have much more time in an off season. So I guess I just wanted to clear that up with anybody listening. It's much different.
No,
than the
yeah,
NFL
and then
right now.
Adam and I talked about it yesterday, right? I mean, there's so many different ways to get to the end result, and you look at GPS tracking, right? You hear GPS, what's the first thing you think? The GPS that in my car that helps me get from one place to another place, right? And that's what you guys do. You guys are trying to help these athletes and these teams get from one place to another place. And how you do it depends on the metrics that you use and the situation that you're in. And Adam, I think I want to go to you real quick, because remember what I said about GPS. I mean, it's almost performance development, minimizing injury, return to play. That's always constantly happening with GPS analytics. Adam, minimizing injury like soft tissue, right? Or return to play of soft tissue issues. Can you talk about what are some of the metrics that you look at to help minimize soft tissue issues? And what are some of the metrics that you use in trying to get someone to come back from a soft tissue issue?
All right, so we just to piggyback a little bit off Chris too on that communication. So all these metrics are great, and you can pick, like, I mean, if you look at something like ForceDex or whatever, it's got like 600 metrics or something that you can pull from it, and it's like, okay, well, which ones do you use? And you can use whatever you want, but as long as if you aren't articulating them correctly to the coach or the end, whoever's making that decision at the end of the day to either increase or decrease practice or whatever it is, then it's kind of just a waste of time. Really, so like, again, like what Grant's doing, he's taking multiple metrics, he's putting one spot, he's giving it to the coach is one number opposed to 17 different numbers, and that's just a lot more easy to digest for most people, especially just learning your audience, just being able to bridge that gap of communication, and then finding that common ground, right? So just making sure everybody's speaking the same language. But as far as your question on injury management, stuff like that, obviously, you're trying to progress these guys in appropriate manners as much as you can. And really all you can really do at a certain point, at least with us, is monitor, right? So you're just monitoring their loads and how are they hitting the top end speeds? Are they training at end range? Are they, if not, then why aren't they? Is there other contextual factors as far as, do they have 9 receivers in that group opposed to 7, or do they have 7 now opposed to 9? And why are these guys' numbers getting like crazy out of control? We might be like, hey, I know there's not much we can do about this because we can't control the fact that maybe 3 guys went down and now we have 7. So they have to increase the amount of reps they're doing in the same amount of practice duration. So now they're hitting, maybe 500 yards or 600 at 16 plus, right? So it's like, opposed to the 250, maybe they were hitting regularly. And you're like, okay, we need to do something about this, and you got to bring it up, and you got to, again, have that relationship and that language with that coach to articulate that to them without them being like, well, we're not taking them off. Well, we're never trying to take them off the field, right? We just want to make sure they stay on the field. That's the biggest goal there. And as far as return to play or So a lot of our biggest emphasis too, especially during the off season, and pretty much throughout the year is loading the brakes in a way, right? So as athletes, we're really good at producing force. We're really bad at receiving it, right? So if you ever watch a guy jump, he'll jump through the roof. When you watch him land, if you ever go to the combine, you watch these guys jump and then they land, and you're like, you cringe sometimes because the way they're landing, it just kind of makes your knees hurt. It's not your back or whatever it is. It's like you're just watching them and it makes you cringe a little bit. But it's no different than, so if you're not training the appropriate muscle groups or whatever it is to absorb that load opposed to the joints, then I think you're almost going to find injury at some point down the road. Maybe not that year, maybe not that next year, but at some point. So again, so those metrics like Grant was saying, so like the metabolic load or whatever, like the accelerations, decelerations, and making sure we're translating that into the weight room as well. Or if we're doing plyos or something like that, we're really emphasizing the landing aspect of it more so than the takeoff. It's like, okay, we know you're powerful, right? You wouldn't be here at this level if you weren't, right? So we want to make sure we just kind of reel it in. So it's like, we can use the analogy or car analogy is like, okay, these guys are Ferraris, but they got Corolla brakes, so like the car's just going to go, it's not going to be able to stop. It's just going to crash into something, and maybe that the landing mechanism didn't actually hurt him, but him not being able to land correctly, landing into something else or falling incorrectly did cause the injury. So it could be indirectly related, but however, just using some of these metrics to kind of, as he's getting those exhales, if they're doing short route patterns opposed to long route patterns or linear patterns, whatever it is, if they're going go routes all day, they might not be getting as much as that during another day. So you just got to make sure and find that balance of whatever it is you're looking for, whatever's important to the coach at the time, possibly specific to that player, maybe especially if you're getting wide receivers that are weighing 220, some of the skill position safeties weighing around 225 or whatever it is. Like, yeah, they have to be, because a lot of those guys are still moving pretty good. So, but from
can't have Corolla brakes and a Ferrari. Remember that, everyone. Put that on the wall.
Great line.
Here's a question, and whomever wants to take this one can take it. And obviously, you guys are all coaching football. With football being so notoriously physical, the high impact collisions that occur in the game. How do you keep track of the wear and tear on the players' bodies throughout the season? I know we have a metric, collision load, but are there ways that you're tracking that through metrics like that or other ways? And we can go with you, Grant. Go ahead, Grant. You want to start with that?
Yeah, so we look at the collision quantity and the collision load metrics a little bit. We probably put more stock into the stress numbers in terms of the dynamic stress load because of its basis on impacts, just because they can come from a lot of different areas and the collision loads can be a little bit volatile. The thing that is great about it, though, is when some of these guys are subject to these huge loads or spikes in load, when you're tracking on the system, you can see when it happened.
Okay.
So I think that's something that's valuable for us. When we see some of these spikes that are through the roof, we can go look at it and be like, okay, hey, this was during team 2 period. We know that this was a live high intensity period. And okay, that explains it. It makes a lot of sense. And also we might be able to look at it, and if it doesn't make some sense, then we can dig a little bit deeper and go from that. But one of the things from a load monitoring standpoint that I really like about the system is that you can really pinpoint when and where things are happening during a practice. And then especially if you're using it in a live tracking scenario. So for us, I think one of the greatest things about the system is looking at it live as it's feeding in through practice. And there's a lot of cool things that you can do with the software where you can set individual thresholds and you can really pick and, okay, I want to dial in and see exactly when this guy's starting to get up there. And that might be 2 hours into the practice. That might be 45 minutes into the practice, depending on the day and where some of these guys are at. So the ability to monitor it and look at it in real time, I think, is a huge advantage when you're trying to manage the stress on the system.
That's huge. That's huge. We did talk about that yesterday, about the importance of live. And I'll go to you, Mark. Can you tell me a decision that was made by your football team based on metrics that you identified that caused you guys to change something in real time or for the next practice?
Yeah. So, Yeah, so we noticed some things immediately last season, and having these data. So after our first game against BC last year, we are under the structure that we practice. We get back on the practice field the day after the game. So on Sundays, we'll play on Saturday. On Sunday, we're back on the practice field, and it's a recovery day. And we do several different things. The coaches go through corrections. We do a stretch period. Coaches go through corrections. Some different ball drills and things. Then there's some tempo, sub-max tempo work, stretch the legs out, get some blood flow. Then there's a flush lift. And kind of what we found out when we looked at the data comparing the game demands to what happened the day after practice, we found that, for our guys that played a lot in the game, they were posting numbers from a high metabolic load distance standpoint that was near what they did for the game. And on the flip side, we actually found out that it was condensed in a whole lot shorter period of time. So the density metric, some of these guys had density measures that were twice what that was for the game, which kind of makes sense once you have that data and you can go back and look at it retrospectively. But that was actionable for us because we knew immediately we needed to figure out, ways to label guys like high load guys, medium load guys, and low load guys based on what they did on game day, and then structure their day after practice accordingly based on what they did. And so that was something that immediately we started doing last season. We built on that now, and kind of speak to a little bit of that. Like, we're getting in now, going into the second year of having GPS technology to really start diving into some of the dose response relationships. So for example, looking at neuromuscular status and look as a way to objectively assess between different training load measures and the actual neuromuscular status, so that we can use that to assess readiness as one part of our readiness assessment, the objective part throughout the season, and kind of monitor training loads accordingly.
I love it. I love it. I mean, Grant, you talked about live and Mark, that story about you guys making a decision in real time based on the data. We all know that soft tissue injuries typically happen when the body is over fatigued. And for you guys to be able to adjust the practice based on that data could have saved you 4 or 5 injuries during the season. I mean, it's big. Grant or Chris,
if I can add this season, because I learned a lot from Grant and Mark. I said, and Adam, when we spoke earlier, during this COVID situation, but we learned the hard way on 2 occasions this fall. And I'm open to share it because I'm an open book here. But we had a backup running back, and then we had a third string, nickel that both experienced grade 1 hamstring injuries mid to late season, and they were out about 10 days, 9 to 10 days. They missed one game too much. And when we look back at, because neither of the guys felt anything coming along, and one of these guys is a pretty in-tuned athlete that, he opens up on an inside zone play on Wednesday practice and pops through and untouched and into the second level and gets into top end. And he's a track runner in high school. So he's got pretty good top end gait. And about 25 yards down the field, the sniper hits him. And again, it wasn't a severe injury. He was back and he missed one game. But when we looked back at the previous weeks of data, he began playing some special teams that he wasn't playing in the weeks before. And so moving into this season, we'll be able to see a relative spike, in stress, in load, in speed intensity and dynamic stress load and high metabolic load. And we'll be able to, at that point, interject, because it wouldn't have been difficult to see if we'd had the threshold set correctly. And that would have been an easy, quick change that would have prevented those grade 1 hamstring deals. And going to prove very valuable this offseason.
I think along the lines with that too, Coach, you and I had talked about it, but we saw very similar things early on when we were using the system as well. And that's there's definitely a trial and error, and there's a period of time where you have to get the information so you know what it means for your team and your athlete and the style of play that you have. But one of the things that's cool about it is a lot of times you can go back and see some of those patterns, and it don't make you feel any better when you go back and see the pattern because you're like, damn, like I missed it. You know, I really should have done something with that. But now you have some ammo going forward to the future. And as we all talk about, you know, relationships with coaches, if I can go up there and be like, hey, coach, you know, we all know this guy popped his hammy. Look at what his workloads looked like before that. You know, now when we see it again, I can say, hey, you remember when this guy got hurt? We're seeing something similar with this guy. We really got to make a, you know, productive decision in terms of what he does at practice tomorrow. And now you have some ammunition and an example that's going to hit home for your staff and your athletes, you know, to justify the decisions you're making.
You know, Greg, you touched on something I think is big, especially for the STATSports system, that, you know, the live nature of raw data during practice and being able to make real-time decisions, but the insight that you're able to get in real time and use that as not just ammo, but an education piece for the coaches that you guys are dealing with so that they continue to evolve in terms of, you know, what's important to make sure that their players perform better, minimize injury, or get back on the field quicker. So I appreciate that. Hey, Marc, give us just a brief little piece on what your PhD is on and how it's applicable to what you feel like can help not just Virginia Tech, but it'll help all college football and professional football.
So my PhD, I had a quick question about that in the Q&A down there too. So all my data collected from my dissertation is field-based, which I think is really important for folks, you know, that are working with American football as practitioners of sports science to be involved day to day with the program. So I've been fortunate enough to be able to use data collected in a real world setting and you know, for my dissertation. You know, I'm doing a manuscript format, so I have a couple of things I'm looking at in my two manuscripts I'm writing. One, I kind of touched on, I was looking at what metrics should we be, you know, should we be monitoring when we're quantifying the training loads of American football players, and how might that differ based on different position groups?
Okay, cool. All right, all my friends out there who have been, you got questions and, what happened? There I am. How do I get out of here? Okay, we're gonna jump into Q&A after this. Excuse me? Someone say something?
I'm sorry, I was gonna finish what I was saying, but.
Oh, you know what, you're breaking up a little bit, so I thought that you were finished. Sorry about that. You still there?
No, sorry, I got knocked off. No, I was just saying in the second part of that, I am, you know, really, you know, diving into being able to understand the dose response relationship between some of these training load measures and different types of outcomes regarding, you know, particularly neuromuscular status. Because I think that, you know, when we can contextualize some of these training loads more, it gives us a better idea to how to manipulate them based on different individuals or based on different position groups. So that's a little about my dissertation, and I think it will be really applicable in the sport of American football because it's coming from the sport in field-based data, and I think that's important when looking at the practical application of your data.
Huge. That's huge. Hey guys, if you don't mind, because I know we could talk for days, and I got questions for days as well. But I want to go to the Q&A session real quick and grab some of these questions from some of our visitors. The first one is, and they didn't specify, but it said, in each of your opinions, what is the most important part of preparation leading into a season? And how do you train differently at the beginning of a season to the end of a season coming in? And either one of you guys can take that one.
There.
It's loaded, huh?
Yeah.
I mean, so for me, I guess I would say that goes back to the communication piece is one. You got to know what your coach wants. So understanding what your coach wants his athletes to look like, year or whatever it is. And then once you kind of find that, you gear everything or you're training towards that goal to reach that specific that the coach would like, as well as what you think is also important too, right? You know, combine that in there in the long run, but making sure they're at least robust enough to handle the stress loads that they're going to start handling in practice once that starts to happen for us anyways. And then being able to maintain the stress load without overdoing it and without underdoing it. Because actually there was one year in my experience that we had maybe a few more soft tissue injuries than usual, and we're going, well, and it's typically guys that don't see, and you sit there and collect all the data from that end, and you're kind of looking at it and you go, well, they weren't doing enough. Maybe we were too soft on them a little bit, and then once they were hitting those end ranges in the games and stuff like that, and then we started seeing some of the injuries. So you got to find that, again, finding that balance. And again, I think the coaching element, you kind of have to just use your instinct. And I know we talk about all this data that we collect and all these machines that we use and all these things, but you can never really remove that coaching element from it. I can sit there and watch my guy without even looking at some of the live data saying like, he ain't right today. He's just, I'll call up coach and be like, hey, check, see how he's doing. And we have a guy that goes, checks, sees how he's doing. He's like, oh, I feel great. Okay. Well, your body tells me otherwise. Your body language says otherwise. And maybe he got moved up and he's just been banged up a little bit. And he doesn't want to tell anybody. So maybe we have to just cause an intervention of some sort. But I know that's not a direct answer for probably whatever that question was, but
No,
I think it's,
go ahead.
Use your instincts, use your experience. And again, you're going to end up learning from your mistakes as well. That's part of it. Unfortunately, this is a trial and error job, and no one likes to hear that. Coaches definitely not. But
There's definitely an art form to it, right?
Yeah, you just have. I think if you trust your instinct, your knowledge and what you've gained in the field, and from others. So
you had a great point in my estimation, Adam. You said we got to prepare them for whatever the coaches that we're working with, right? What's their first week of practice going to look like in training camp? So to me, the preparation for the season is going to be really preparing them for the first couple of weeks of practice physically. So what does that mean? Well, that's, it's not necessarily the strongest. It's not necessarily the fastest. It's powerful. It's condition, it's fitness. It's the ability to last day in, day out over a 5 to 6 day first week, which, we're getting better and better, I think, at communicating that it's not wise anymore to go balls to the wall, 3 days in a row, 4 days in a row at a training camp. But, anyway, the communication with the coaching staff is vital. But once they're in football mode and they're getting the speed and the power work on the football field, in my estimation, the weight room becomes a little bit more in season, like, okay, are we maintaining the ability to put force into things? So, we peaked a couple of times last season. We actually had 2 bye weeks last season. The calendar was on a unique year for that. But we had 2 bye weeks where we hit 90, 95, some 100%, specific movements. It was a freeboard press, I think, the first phase, and then it was a chain back squat, I think, in phase 2. I think it was a trap bar deadlift phase 1. Either way, the loads these guys were able to hit, the force they were able to put into the ground in a weight room or into the bar was substantial. But we didn't do that a lot. We periodized it so we could do it when we needed to. I feel like it's important to still be able to do that in season, especially when they're getting the speed and the power work on the field. But like Grant and I talked, if they're not hitting 90% of their practice speed or their game speed in a week, then we need to intervene maybe on a Wednesday or on a Thursday or on a Friday, whatever those days, and help them open up a little bit to make sure they're prepared for that game.
And one thing I feel like I learned from all of you guys is that, GPS allows you to validate what you see, what your experience and expertise, is allowing your eyes to see. That's interesting. Hey, someone just asked another question, and it brings in the big picture. All right?
Cecil, sound like Thanos right now to y'all?
Darth Vader.
A little bit.
You got me. Hey, I got one here. It says from Brian Clark. Yes. Does the data you collect influence how you approach training specific position groups in the off season? So, example, your skill, your big skill, things like total distance, high speed, acceleration, deceleration. Any of you guys can take that, but I would love for you to answer that first from the D-line, O-line perspective, back to the linebacker, fullback, tight end. Because I feel like the D-line, the D-backs and the receiver, the skill guys, there's always relevance with GPS. But whomever can take that, I love that one, Mr. Clark.
Yeah.
Who wants one?
So for that, I mean, it definitely influences on how you kind of look at things, because obviously, you know, you got a guy that's weighing 300 pounds. He's not probably his sprint yard is not really 16 plus. I mean, I've seen guys hit 18, but they're not doing it all the time. It's probably because if there was some type of turnover on the field or some sort. But I mean, I think it's important to kind of put that and make it relative to the position. It's okay, yeah, they're not hitting 16 plus, and that's what we communicate as to coach as a sprint yard, you know. But you know, and you got to be kind of careful if you want to make it relative, because if you're telling, okay, well, you're showing reports and O-line has 160 sprint yards because you placed it at 12 plus, and maybe some of the receivers only got 40 sprint yards because they're at 16 plus, and the coach is looking at it and going, oh, why are my O-line guys sprinting more than my, you know. So again, back to that communication. If you don't communicate what a sprint yard is, like that from the beginning, it just causes more confusion and in the long run. But yes, I think the data collection does play a role in how you, especially with like some of the acceleration, deceleration, or is it going to be more emphasis towards the skills position as it is the big positions? Yeah, maybe some bigger positions where if they're a drop end, that, you know, you might experience a little bit more of that. So you have to definitely make it relative to the position group. But again, try to still keep it simple from a reporting standpoint, where it's still easily to understand and articulate to someone, and everybody's still on the same page.
No, that's perfect. And I think, you know, the great thing about the STATSports system is that you can't individualize, right? Instead of it just being a group, you can really make sure that every metric for every individual player is set. Let's get another one. I saw a good one here. Okay. How do you use GPS as monitoring guys' speed who are either prone to hamstring injuries or coming back from hamstring injury? Have you ever used it during repeated sprints with increasing percentages during hamstring rehab? You know, maybe that's not for you, Adam.
So from a return to play standpoint, and I see the other question above as well, is like in any rehab practices. So we can kind of combine those two. The final checkbox is to ensure that the player is ready, return to practice and return to full competition. So I think that's where you get that, you have that good relationship with the training staff in itself, right? So making sure you guys have that common ground on finding what's important to coach, like the severity of what the injury was, what's a realistic return, at what level, right? So, and I think once, you know, they're the specialists, they're the smart ones in knowing the injury itself and where it is at from a tolerance standpoint. So they'll do their job in the confined setting of their office and strengthen them till they get to that point where they can kind of slowly start integrating into that practice. I mean, we're never just going to throw a guy right back into the indie drills thinking he's ready to go. You know, obviously the injury dictates what we do with them, right? So most often, if it's a lower extremity injury, it's going to play a little bit more role on easing them back in, especially if a guy has historical injury, what maybe you feel his behavior patterns are like outside. Is he really one of those guys that takes care of himself, or is he one of those guys that takes care of himself that kind of really doesn't because he does too much, you know? But so you got to kind of like use your judgment there too. But as far as you can break it into, so if we might just slowly integrate a guy into percentages based on what he's done average over the past few years, depending on how much data we have off him. So we might take him in, say, okay, this guy's coming back from a calf strain. He's ready to kind of start running. They might have done some running already on the side, not in practice. And maybe we start putting pads on him because now we can get pads into him during the season. And maybe they're doing stuff still on the side, not within periods. Then we might slowly start integrating them into a period and maybe something less stressful like an indie drill or whatever. And then maybe we go from indie to a 7-on-7 where they're lining up against somebody and kind of testing it that way. Again, it's still, you're using that and you're kind of using your judgment there too. You're talking to the guy, how did it feel? What is it? And then you start looking at the data saying, he's like, oh man, I felt great. I felt like I was killing it. And he's, you know, typically hits 20 miles an hour when he's only hitting 14 in the same route or whatever it is he's doing. And you go, okay, we make the judgment call. He might not be ready yet. You know, maybe just didn't get the confidence back. And that takes time for some guys. People that have played before, I think they respect and understand that, you know, if you're coming back from a knee injury, hesitant the first few times you step back out on that field, and you can watch the body language of the guy where he's just like, but then you slowly start seeing that come back, and then you can start pushing them a little bit more. And sometimes they got to be pushed during that phase too, just to, hey, you're gonna be okay. You can do more. But using that data to help drive that and answer some of those questions, I think it definitely plays a huge role as far as, if, from a periodization standpoint, guy returning the play. Okay, we want him to do 30% of what he usually does. Total, doesn't matter what it is right now. We just want him to get out there. Once he hits 30%, cut him off. So we might pull him out. And then maybe he's not completely done. He's just done experiencing practice. We might take him on the side and we'll still train, right, for the length of the practice or whatever it is. So he's still getting that volume or the training load. It's just now it's specified specifically towards him. It's like you think you bend something over and over again, it's going to break. So if you use the same repetitive pattern that caused injury in the first place and they're not ready to come back, I think there's a good chance you're going to either re-injure or injure something else because the compensation of some sort. But so I think it's, again, you're just using common sense and, just instinct and talking to the other professionals around you and see what they think, and just communication. And everybody kind of comes into the right field, and they'll figure it out,
Okay, man, that's a great answer, man. I'm sure that they got a lot out of that. Hey, I understand I might have some technical difficulties. I heard that I sound like Darth Vader out here.
A little bit.
Still sound like Darth Vader.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of cool.
Long echo.
Oh, but it's kind of cool. Okay. Hey, I think what we've touched on a lot of is kind of the hard applications of utilizing GPS analytics and monitoring. But there's some other things that each of us have talked about, and I'd love for you guys to talk about it, and that's the competitive nature of what your athletes get from being able to see their numbers and see how they're doing in comparison to the other positions. And I think I'll probably, let me start with Marc to talk about not just the competitive side, but I think athletes sometimes begin to get really interested in what their numbers are. They get invested into what their development is and what those numbers say. So, Marc, why don't you start off if you aren't having technical difficulties?
Yeah. So I think, the guys love.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the guys love getting feedback. Obviously, like speed numbers are the first ones that the guys got interested in, like want to know what speeds they hit. That's kind of the low hanging fruit. But then, as we started sharing more information regarding some of the other metrics and what that information, meant, like they got interested in knowing, where they were in comparison to their position groups. We have a linebacker, and he comes in there and he wants to know that he got more, high intensity yardage than some of his other guys. Cause he equates that to, I'm going putting in more effort, I'm going harder than the other guys. They get interested in that. And then part of it is just, they ask questions. They get curious about different things and how we might use this and, what it means. The same deal with how we share, some of our jump data, from our CMJs, beyond just jump height. They get interested in, relative power. They get interested in some of these other measures. And I think it's cool because it opens up conversations. It gets them, hanging around and just helps you develop relationships. It helps you get more buy-in from them. And I think and then obviously the competition aspect, I think they love it. We have a great group of guys that just, they, we never have any issues with anything. They're excited to get their information back. They're excited to, they don't complain about having to put extra things on or anything like that. Like we do heart rate as well. So they do the unit and the heart rate unit, and then other things. So yeah, I think it's great. It's, it's another avenue to communicate. It's another way to give them feedback, and they definitely love it.
Kids will grab the iPad post-practice or post-training session. The iPads are great. Sometimes we'll have 2 or 3 out there because we have a data analytics club on campus that has become fired up about helping us and helping each other really. And so the kids will come up and they'll grab the iPad and they'll scan through and find their profile. It's and like Marc said, it's created a lot more interest and intrigue into our field. Really, some of our guys realize there's a lot more to it, than just coaching weights, for example, right?
Just like that, add on to that too, as far as like what we found when we started, I think we're growing up in the world of like video games, right? Where everyone plays video games, everything, like the highest number wins or the highest score wins, whatever. So it's like, and then you start putting stuff on the board. If I ask a guy to do a CMJ, so it's not just GPS, right? If I just do a guy to do a counter movement jump or something like that on force plates, and he could just do it and walk away. But as soon as I put that on a board in the weight room while they're training or something like that, and everybody sees it, either they're calling them out or whatever it is, now it all of a sudden becomes that competition. Now I'm getting at least max effort for that which I wanted to begin with. And so if that helps feed that, or if you're using velocity-based training and you're doing like maybe a clean pull or whatever it is, and you just want to record the last rep, but then so you just put that one on the leaderboard and you're getting max pulls out of that. So you can actually get some good data based on that. And you make it fun for them, make it a video game, and you get that give them that feedback, like these Marc and Chris was saying. I'm sure Grant's had the same experience. I didn't mean to cut you off.
There's what's get measured gets done.
Say it again.
There's a saying that says, what gets measured gets done.
Yeah.
And I think the ability to measure it, helps push some of these guys to another level because they know, I'm being tracked and I'm being watched. And one of the things he talks about with the GPS is, we're making sure we're protecting these guys from injury, which is a huge part of it. But another part of it that's awesome is the kick in the butt when you didn't practice as hard as you were supposed to. And now all of a sudden you're sharing that information and it's posted up on the screen. You're like, man, you only had 700 high intensity yards at practice today. Everybody else is over it. What's that about? And you'll see guys get pissed and they're out for blood the next day and they're attacking that thing because they know that the standard is set higher than that. And I think that's, a huge part of it too. We're always worried about doing too much, but just as important is, like I said, the kick in the butt. It gives some of these guys to make sure they're doing enough to be prepared, because not doing enough is just as risky as doing too much. And so I think that's a huge part of it. And it drives the competition in just the way that these guys practice, knowing that it's being measured.
And honestly, our football coaches, they gravitate to that first. And that was their first. Can I see if my guys are working hard with this? That was a question a couple of different coaches ask on our staff, is like, how can I tell if my guy was actually working? Well, it's a little bit relative, but you can see, like you said, high intensity yards, high metabolic load yards, and you can reference, if they take the same number of reps, if you got, a first team mic and a second team mic and they're taking the same reps, same script, which is not really never the case, but it's similar. Okay. How many, how hard did this guy work relative to this guy? It was used at some level, I think early on, kind of not how I intended it, but again, it created a little bit of buy-in with the coaching staff. And so, you kind of give and take a little bit.
I want to put a caveat to what Grant was saying about the athletes knowing they're being tracked. So like, I guess at our level, it's a little bit different because there's some gray area on what's mandatory for them to do, what's not mandatory for them to do. For the most part, as long as it's coming from the top, the buy-in's pretty good. But for the caveat to that is if they know that they're being tracked, a lot of times they don't maybe want to give that information, right? And that brings up a question in itself, So to me, all this data collection ever did, like the first thing it ever leads to is intervention, right? Like you kind of ask yourself why. Like you answer the contextual factors, you ask those, and then you go, okay, well, why is this? Does he just had a big night? He didn't, he went out, didn't get home till 3 o'clock in the morning, and he's like, I'm not jumping today. I'm not going to jump today. Or he might throw his GPS in the trash and he take you 2 hours to look for it. Well, practice has already started, and I'm not going to be the one around there and stop practice to make sure a guy gets one on, because the spotlight's on me at that point. But like, so you got to kind of at least from my experience, you have to be a little bit careful on how you articulate that to the player as well. I mean, it took me almost 2 years to get one guy just to buy in, because I helped him get a day off or a walkthrough or whatever it was, for him, or just some type of to pull back from him or whatever it is. And whatever you can use to find and get that buy-in. I'm not saying like lie to the guy or manipulate anything, but I think it's just as important to get the buy-in from the player as it is from the coaches because like again at this level, they have the luxury of being like, I'm not doing that, and it maybe not, depending on who the decision maker is, might provide some repercussions based on that decision that athlete made, but then they might not too. So and you just don't know which way it's going to go regardless, because honestly, maybe that's just not the most important thing at that time in the day anyway. So, so for me, it's just, yes, it is important. It's important to give them that feedback and that they do know they're being tracked. It's just at a certain level when they know they don't need to, they can kind of manipulate it and kind of find cracks that they can seep through and get away from. We're jumping today, and you see guys just kind of sneaking out the back door or something like that, just because for whatever reason, it's, hey, you didn't jump today. What happened? My knees are sore. Oh, okay, just say that. I'm not gonna put you in a position for yourself, but I think I just wanted to it's different level. I think at a college level, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's these guys still have that stepping stool of I got to get to that next level, and I got to prove it to everybody still, which I totally get. And I don't know if that changes as they become seniors or whatever, or how they get looked at from a prospect standpoint. But I think, just being cautious of that as well, depending on where you are and what level you're at, that, they might not have to, and then you might not get anything because, maybe you just worded it wrong. I've been there too. So
I think Adam, that's a great point. And that's, being transparent. That's something we made a mistake with early on. The first year we had the system, it was something we tracked and we took the information to the coaches, but we didn't share a lot of it with the players. We posted top speed because that's a hot button and everybody wanted to see it. And over the next few years, the more we shared with the guys, and it's common sense, right? Communication helps everything. But when we started to show the data a lot more to our guys and, break it down for them and explain it and post it up, it tremendously helped with the buy-in from the athletes when they understood what the data means. And the end game is the only reason that we're using this, guys. The only reason we're tracking this is to help you, to make you the best athlete that you can be. And I think, exactly what you're saying, the better you communicate that and show them, even when it is from that place where it's a kick in the butt, this is only to help prepare you. It's only to make you better. And first and foremost, building that relationship. But I think that's a huge part of it, is you have to be transparent with the data with the athletes, because it's their data. That's the work that they're putting in. And if they're going to buy into it and be supportive of what we're trying to accomplish to help them, they have to be a part of the process.
Everybody's motivated differently, right? I mean, and some of our guys were inspired by the reality that there was maybe half of the scouts that came through this year for us. And we had 2 guys drafted. We had a guy that went, early as a free agent. And there was, half the scouts were privy to this technology. They were interested. Hey, what so-and-so hit, in games, padded, like what did he hit on that 65-yard touchdown run? And I pulled up the data, and they were able to see, what he was hitting consistently as an athlete, under our care. And so, it was a really positive thing from a recruiting standpoint. And I say recruiting, but scouting standpoint to the next level. And so, those guys that want to play in the National Football League, that's another little motivating factor that maybe it might carry them over that 3rd year, 4th year hump when they've been tracked for a couple of years in a row. It's like, well, we want to keep you above 20 all the time. Like you want to be a 20 guy easy and padded, you want to be in pads hitting 21, 22. Like that's the kind of guys that play, for 10 years in the league, 15 years in the league, not just get a shot,
I hear you. Hey, do I still sound like Darth Vader?
A little bit.
All right. Well, we're gonna start to round this up. But what I'd like to do is and starting with you, Grant, I'd love for you to just kind of give me your best motivational football quote. That thing. I know there's that thing that everyone knows that you say. Every guy that comes to your program and trained by you, all of you guys have that thing. And then also, what your favorite thing is about the STATSports system. And then we'll just say, we'll say goodbye from there. So we'll start with you, Brandon. Let's someone else. Let's start.
I got lucky that this is on the wall in the weight room, so it came to me real quick.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a saying. Acronym for it is LIT, but on the door on the way in and out of the weight room, it says your legacy is today. And that's kind of a rallying cry for us, because it's the way that you want to be remembered, 5, 10, 15 years from now is not something that gets created overnight. It's every single day what you do is going to build that legacy. So our guys who have dreams of going to the NFL and being able to take care of their family and step by step, think about what you want, the legacy that you want to have down the road, and what are you going to do today to bring it to life? Because it's an everyday process. And I think we all talk from a training standpoint about the process, and that's just our way of kind of rounding out the legacy that you want, the way you want to be remembered. What are you doing today to bring it to life? And not just the way that you're training, the way that you're living, everything that you're doing, not just as a football player, but as a person. And that's a really big thing for us and part of our program. As far as the system goes, I kind of already touched on it, but I think just to track things live is my favorite part of it. I think that's one of the separating factors of the system is when I can look at it in practice and then be able to go over to a coach and say, hey, this is where this guy's at, and we can make a decision. I just think that's really cool, the ability that we can be proactive in real time because of what the system allows us to do.
Boom, Grant Geib, Western Michigan University. Check him out. Appreciate it. Who wants to go next? Chris, you got this, don't you?
Yeah, I'll take it.
I just want one.
Yeah, one quote. So, and it's, a lot of times we find information that validates kind of who we are. I get this, but first page of the playbook, 2005, when I was blessed enough to play football for the Indianapolis Colts. Tony Dungy was the head football coach. Bill Polian was the GM. Alan Williams, DB coach. Ron Meeks was the D coordinator. Coach Murph, our linebacker coach. Leslie Frazier was an assistant to Tony Dungy at that point in time. And just the way Tony handled his business, and he got it from Chuck Noll, but it kind of epitomized the culture of that program that I felt like, epitomizes it. Champions are not champions because they do extraordinary things. They're champions because they do the ordinary things better than everybody else. Or how I've rephrased that at times, do the ordinary things better than you've done it the day before. So the details, right? Attack the details, attention to detail. We use ATD all the time in our training methodology and training culture. The little things right will separate, the good from the great from the championship, and the consistent championship from the guys that maybe just hit it one time. So that's a big, personally in my life, and then and how I coach. In terms of the favorite part about the system, I think the track and live is awesome. I think the buy-in is awesome. I think the big takeaway for me from year one, there was a couple of them, but to me the biggest one was the reality that hit me right in the face like a ton of bricks. And I got it pulled up on my screen to my right. Our offensive lineman that got drafted in the 4th round in 14 weeks of the season, including the bowl prep, so 15, 16 weeks, he had 70% of his top end speed is what we call high speed yardage. And he ran 150 yards above 70% of his top speed all season. I mean, he hit, 400 or 500 yards above 70% in the summertime in 1 week. And so it kind of hit me in the face. It's like, well, what am I preparing this young man to do? And it just forced me to reflect and, okay, why am I really having our offensive linemen and defensive tackles run at top speeds in an off season? I really got to have a good answer in my mind because they're not doing it when they play football. And the reality that they still run the 40 at the combine, and our offensive lineman did run the 40 at the combine and ran a pretty good time. But maybe he would have ran better if he would have maintained some of those qualities throughout, September and October. And as long as that's a metric they use to measure, 320-pound guys, then we need to still figure out what makes sense. So it was illuminating, and it proved a lot of the things that I was seeing over the years, but just showed me right in the face that our receivers are hitting 10, 12, 15,000 yards above 70% in the season, and our offensive linemen are not even close. They're not even playing the same game. And that was a really exciting element that I was able to kind of pick through and pack through and talk to these guys about in the last couple of months.
That's great, man. That's great. Adam, you got something for me?
Yeah, I'm not much of a quote guy, but I remember one. I just remember seeing it like going through school and whatever. The moment you quit attempting the momentarily impossible, the moment you stop advancing. And for me, that was I was actually doing my associate's degree right when I had gotten out of the military, and Arthur Jones said it, the inventor of Nautilus equipment, right? And if you've ever watched some of his interviews, he's different, but but he's very intelligent, right? So, and I don't know, for whatever reason, that one really just hit me, and it just made me want to do more and more, to be better and better. And it was almost the same mentality you have in the military, in a sense. It's like, okay, I'm 1% of America now. I want to be 1% of the 1%. You know, I want to keep moving up. And, you know, if you feel like that's capped somewhere, then maybe that's not your destiny. You go on and do different things. You keep trying to do whatever it is. As far as the STATSports, I think the one of the biggest qualities that's really helped us is the Bluetooth watch that you wear with it. I'm able to, well, during practice,
Apple Watch.
if we have the guy rehabbing, I can just give that to the trainer, and he can and it gives them kind of some type of ownership in it too, and it's good cross training for them again. So you're building that back to that language, and they're kind of understanding a little bit more because now they're using it themselves. And I don't have to be sidebarred of, hey, what's he doing now? What's he doing now when I'm trying to watch the other 90 guys during training camp or whatever it is, you know? So I think that's been a very big piece as far as what helps. It helps kind of reduce some of my stuff that I have to do and focus on, which always helps. You become a little bit more efficient and streamline things more that way. And then you're killing two birds with one stone. And, you know, then you just gives her more room for that intervention and people to understand what's happening with that individual, whatever it is. So
Cool, man. Cool. Mark, our resident PhD. You there?
Yeah, I'm here.
All right. Did you hear the question?
Yeah. First, I just want to give a shout out to Adam because, man, I tell you, out of the small group of people that work in this area and with American football, and we happen to be two airborne infantrymen that end up working this for our career, we're going to have to sit down and have a beer at some point in time, connect a little bit and talk about some things. But yeah, as far as you know, a saying, I think if it's important to you, you'll find a way. If it's not, you'll find an excuse. You know, what I always, you know, like to say is fall in love with the process. It's day in, day out. Consistency is greater than intensity. And so I think that's something that is, you know, part of our program, part of what we tell our guys, part of the way I've lived my life. You know, it's, you know, showing up every day, if it's important to you, making sure you get it done, being consistent with it. And I think that's, you know, for me, something I keep in the back of my mind all the time, something that we tell our guys and really make a forefront of our program, to be consistent just day in, day out, fall in love with that process. And, you know, if it's important to you, you'll find that way. As far as the sports, you know, there's several things I love about it. These guys have already mentioned the live monitoring. That's really useful in return to performance, as well as, you know, conditioning, things like that. But I'll touch on a couple other things. I like the individualization of the thresholds, like being able to ease of the system, being able to go in there. And once you have that data, you're able to go and set individual thresholds with real ease, you know, as a system administrator. And then also the ease of downloading the raw data. Part of our return to performance protocol is gate symmetry, which involves going and downloading the raw data. And I run that through a MATLAB algorithm, and then calculate a gate symmetry, just percentage. I have their norm, and then I can look at what their first day out in a controlled setting in the return to performance setting and see what it is there. And that's an indicator we use as part of our return to performance protocol all the way through. And so it's real easy to download that raw data, which I know with other systems is not always that way. And then setting those individual threshold levels once you have that data and you can do that, that's really easy to do. And so I think those are a couple of the features that I love.
Right. All right. I didn't forget anyone like in the beginning, did I?
No, you sound good too now. No more Darth Vader.
Oh, really?
Clean, baby.
Well, hey, before I let you guys go, I got to send a shout out to the guys that you guys work with mainly. You know, we got Nick Dykes, part of our North American team, Stephen Philbert, and you guys have already mentioned Emmett Carey, but we can't forget, you know, the princess of our group, Kaz, who works mainly with the soccer teams. Guys, I really appreciate you guys coming on. Obviously, do I still sound better?
Great.
You're good.
Okay. Obviously, everyone, there is so much to strength and conditioning in sports science that you can't get into all of it in a 90-minute period. But I appreciate you guys coming on and just sharing your thoughts and your ideas. You know, I think that the more knowledge we have, the more important it is for us to share that knowledge. And you guys were gracious enough not only to come on and share your knowledge, but also, you know, talk about being a partner of ours. And let me just say this, at STATSports, we are privileged and honored to be partnered with each and every one of you. And I look forward to continually helping you take your use of our GPS system to the next level. If there's nothing else, everyone, thank you, and God bless.
Appreciate it, Cecil.
You got it. Take care.
fellas.
Thank
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you,
guys.
Cecil. I appreciate all you guys.
Mark
you.
will link.
I was taking notes.
No doubt. I'd like to be a fly on the wall when Adam, you and Mark get together. That'd be
Oh,
good
man.
conversations
Yeah. I want to be there too. We won't say nothing. We just want to sit there.
just listen.
Hear the stories.
That's right.
Unbelievable. All right.
All right, fellas. Talk to you.
Peace.
Yep. See you guys.
Take care, guys.
See you guys.